Hello, welcome to our panel. This panel is got a really pretentious title that I made up and I forget what it was, but it's basically about board games and video games and game design thereof. So I found everyone I knew who had done both tabletop gaming and video gaming professionally. And I'm going to cruelly say, is there anyone else in the audience who has done both tabletop design and video design? And what I'm going to say is, how about you come join our panel? You're shaking your head. Did you want to join the panel?
No, I got to make a D&D character, but this is you go.
Okay, so I just thought, because we wanted to get all of them, and so there's at least two more in the audience, but we'll be up here on the panel, and these guys can talk for anything, so we'll be fine. So speaking of which, my name's Visser. I am a video game designer and a board game designer. Just had a board game out which I co-designed with Jarrett called NZGDC. You can look it up on Board Game Geek and ignore the comments. No, but it's doing well on the ratings and there's lots of discussion. But it won't be available in retail here for probably at least a couple of months. But if you do see it in the shelves, you should go buy it. Video game wise, I worked on a game called Path of Exile for about 9 years. Then I worked for a company called Digital Confectioners, where my first couple of years there I worked on another game called Fortnite, because they were contracting to Epic, and now we do mostly, well, pretty much exclusively original IP now. So I've done some board games and some video games, and they've been published. Jarrett, tell us about yourself.
I'm Jarrett Gray. I am a board gamer and a video game designer. I started in board games first, and I published a bunch of titles, mostly in the Endeavour line with Carl, but also a Hobbit game with Weta, which was pretty fun. Endeavour Deep Sea, as Carl said, has just come out for backers now, and it's getting pretty decent reviews and ratings on Board Game Geek, so pretty happy about that. The comments are definitely the loudest people who are having problems with the game, but everyone else seems to be enjoying it. And everyone I've played it with has seemed to enjoy it, so that's fun. And the video game that I worked on is a game called Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn, which also came out about 3 months ago, I think. And at work we had a lot of fun watching streamers play that and enjoy it, or not enjoy it, because they were not necessarily the audience. But that's more of a action RPG, kind of a little bit Souls-like. And it was fun to design something which I would say is not necessarily my genre of game that I would play, but it was really enjoyable to work on that. Yeah.
I'm Paul Abrahams. I probably come the opposite direction to you guys, starting in video games and exiting video games and going into board games. So I did a couple of games back in the day, Mini Monos and the Etherlight, that we worked on, and recently I've been working in board games. Our company published a small game called Regicide back in 2020, and we just finished kickstarting Regicide Legacy this year. So that's what I've been up to.
That, when he said small, that's false modesty there. Regicide actually did very well.
Oh, well, okay, physically small. It's literally a 52 pack of cards with a rule set.
There's a massive increase in popularity of little card games now as well, and the Japanese are making tons of them, like little tiny games that you can like just carry anywhere with you. So it's, you were early kind of with that.
Trendsetters.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So yeah, we've had people who've gone both directions. But so my first question for you guys is: video game design and board game design is the same thing, right? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, pretty much. No, there's lots of subtle differences, but there's a lot of, I guess, the way I approach both video game design and board game design. There's a heap of crossover between just the kind of the pathways I go down. The example being, so I was working on Etherlight, which was a very like linear story-driven game, and the way we had to design that that we learnt as we worked for 3 years on it was we had this kind of like spiral of design where you do story, then you do some design, then you do some art, then you go back to story, change it to fit the design, change it to fit the art, and go round and round and round until you get kind of into a pinpoint where everything kind of clicking. And then when I went to do Regicide Legacy, I had to do we were doing a linear story through a legacy game. And if I'd never been in the Etherlight and kind of found that process, that design process, I wouldn't have even thought about that way of doing it in board game design, because board game design more traditionally is kind of a little bit more waterfall than the video game space. But it really worked well for us of going, hey, do a story pass, now do a mechanics pass, now do a story pass, now do an art pass, now do a mechanics pass, and just slowly changing. And it's shipping very, very soon, but we're still doing the final little in the middle of the spiral of story versus mechanics. So yeah, I mean, I approach them in the same way. There's different bits and pieces that kind of pop up, but yeah.
I remember it would have probably been 15 years ago now, and I went to a conference with Carl at She, who is now Pickpock. They weren't Pickpock then. I think they'd just started using that name for the mobile games that they were playing, and they just had like this internal conference that they had a few people from outside had come from. And I was only a board game designer at the time, but I had always been interested in designing video games, and I was talked to one of their game designers there afterwards, and I'm like, oh, you know what do you know, what's the difference? How could I become a game designer in video games? And what he said to me was, you're already a game designer. And that always like stuck with me. It's not different. It's the same thing. You might need to know some technical skills for a video game. You might need to know some like other different skills for a board game. But ultimately, the process of how you design a game, where you start with your basic design, your mechanics, whether you're starting with theme or you're starting with mechanics, and how you go through that process to get to an end result, it's still the same thing. And as a game designer, one of our kind of big challenges is communicating our ideas to other people. And in a board game, there's less people you have to communicate those ideas to. But even with Deep Sea, which we just, when we kind of first pitched the idea, the publishers were on board with the idea, but they kind of couldn't see it. And Carl and I are working on, in a spreadsheet, the basic mechanics of the game. And Carl's like, look, I've got like the first like 4 turns of this game mapped out in the spreadsheet. And the publishers couldn't see it at all. So being able to communicate to them, hey, look, this is kind of visually what the board is going to look like, and showing them kind of how these ocean tiles in this particular game, you kind of grow an ocean deeper. And once they saw it, they're like, right, we completely understand what you want to make. They didn't necessarily understand completely how we wanted to make it yet, but they were on board with the idea, and communicating that idea is, in video games, it's the same sort of thing. It's really important that as a designer you can communicate to everyone in a team and get them all on board what you are trying to make, because if they're not on board, you're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah,
Those are good answers, yeah.
just picking up on that communication thing, I think the difference in communication between video games and board games is usually a scale thing. Of like, in video games, you've got big teams who have to do many little things that all have to cohesively go together. In board games, typically one person has got the design vision, and they might be working with one other guy who's kind of helping them refine that. And it's kind of, you can form like these small units. Whereas in video games, it's not you can have hundreds of people working on a game. I don't think in a board game sense. In a video game. And in a board game sense, you don't have that kind of scale. And so your communication skills that you need are kind of like, maybe you can get away with a lot more in board games, in terms of like not being able to communicate it quite as well, or having to have those soft skills that can, work with hundreds, work with people at a large scale. You can work on a small scale team, which is, for some people, a lot easier.
Cool. Now I have a set of questions which are designed to wind these two up and make them fight until there's blood on the floor. So before we do that, I was actually going to do the questions bit now, so they actually get in. And if you guys have loads of questions, that can be everything to the end. So you had a question.
Hi. Just coincidentally, I tweeted it last week into the...
Oh, someone's running up a microphone.
In the recording.
Testing.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, hi. Coincidentally, I happen to have played Endeavour in a 24-hour board game festival that me and my friends were doing yesterday. And one of the really cool things we noticed was that it was as very sustainable in the sense that like the plastic bags were recycled and a lot of aspects of that. And in other board games like Earthborn Ranger, where a lot of the cardboard is recycled paper. What other sort of innovations in that sort of sustainability method do you see in other future board games? Might be completely off topic from what you're...
It may be off topic, but I actually think that's very cool. Because Deep Sea is a game about conserving the deep sea, it felt really bad to have any plastics in it. So luckily, we've got publishers in Canada who are also like it wasn't even a question for them, and Endeavour Deep Sea indeed has lots of recycled cardboard, and even those plastic bags aren't even recycled plastic. There's something else, so it will break down and break down much faster than plastic and turn into safe stuff. So yeah, that's just a separate thing, but glad you enjoyed the game too.
I think those bags are like made of corn. Yeah, it's really interesting that I think other games are kind of doing it as well, trying to be more sustainable. I think that increases the cost a little bit, but I certainly enjoyed the fact that some of the trays were like cardboard with these little nice like sliding cardboard things on them rather than plastic. And we'd always kind of liked games which had wooden pieces anyway, so instead of like lots of plastic things. So the fact that all the pieces are wooden was like, that was always going to be that way, but like everything else kind of like went from there. Yeah,
although the wood was all certified renewable and all that as well. So yeah, off topic, but we have to talk about it.
But it's one of the interesting differences between video games and board games is that you kind of have the whole extra vector of the product it's kind of outside of the design space a little bit, but it influences your design, like the product design of your board game. In video games, you're very rarely thinking about environmental impact. I mean, people doing AI games might be thinking of some of that, but there's definitely that whole extra space of like just the physicality as well as in sustainability that does come back to like, oh, we can't have this many pieces. I can't put thousands of plastic trays in because it's going to A, up costs, B, not be received well by a segment of the market.
The piece budget is real in board games as well.
Yes. Yes.
Endeavour Deep Sea, we hit the point where every extra piece we wanted to add is a fight with the publishers. Like, and I'm not kidding. Like, long argument kind of fights to get them in because why couldn't we have this mechanic which has fewer pieces? Because it's not as good.
Since we are the publishers, we have those internal fights. So I'm usually the publisher pushing back, going, "No, you can't have that piece. You want one extra card? No, we're not having an extra card here."
I do, though. That budget kind of idea is actually useful in video games because humans have a limit to how many things they can keep track of, and having a component budget of what people need to know will actually help you in a video game.
First, a note about the environmental thing. The Green Games Guide, if you're not familiar with it yet, is both the Green Games Guide is a useful tool for both digital game designers and physical game designers as well, for how to consider environmental impact in digital games processing and the physical games process. My question is to Paul specifically. When you were talking about the differences between making analog games and digital games, it sounded like what you were talking about was more a scale of studio difference, which would be a clear difference right there in the result. And I know that there are some physical game studios that act like studios and interfacing with lots of people, and I've worked on physical games, right, at least with 5 other people to make those games. So my question is, if everything was equal in terms of scope, in terms of like maybe artisan video game, artisan physical game,
Yep.
how would you design differently?
I think just picking up on what Carl said is actually applicable to this as well. One of the things that I think is way more prevalent in board game design is the concept of conceptual load. So we have, in Regicide Legacy, we've got a eternal mode at the end which you can play over and over again. And so it's got a randomized setup. So you play through the campaign and then you have this randomized setup at the end. When we first started designing that, we kind of were like, okay, how do you do that? We could break it into like these cards are easy ones, these ones are medium ones, these ones are hard ones. So that's what we first did because that was my natural instinct from working on video games. So we did that, and then when you shuffled up, we just got so many combinations that were like, there's just too much going on. There's, you've got to track this, you've got to track that, you've got to track this. And so what we actually ended up doing was arranging those cards into 6 piles of cognitive load. So it's like these ones, they're one and done. So you're always going to have 2 of the really easy ones. They're going to change the difficulty of the mission, but they're going to be thrown out afterwards. And then you're only going to have 1 of the type of card that will make you like really bend your mind and go, oh, I've got to track that, I've got to track this, but you'll never have a couple of those. So that kind of idea of cognitive load, while it is in video games, 100%, like there is, you do have to track how much a player can, how much they can see on the board, how much they can take in, all that kind of stuff. I'd never really, in working in the video game space, I'd never really like talked about it in that way of like, no, this is just, there's way too much cognitive load, and your ability to mitigate that. If you want to do something in a video game and you're thinking this might be a little bit complicated, you can usually, there's usually different paths you can take to kind of get that, like you can do it under the hood. Whereas in video games, you're like, in board games, you're like, oh crap, I've got to do something different. I can't expect a player to internalize all those rules and actually act them out on the board. And so that's one of the, I guess, one of the major differences I kind of come across in the two different spaces. One of them, there's a few more probably.
Though I would say that in both, the one ways of solving those cognitive load problems is how you present the ideas to the player, and the user experience and the user interface of both board games and video games is really valuable in that regard, and you can't kind of forget about it. If your game is too complicated, video game or board game, like you're probably cutting some stuff out to make it less complicated, but you're also trying to introduce ideas where you're not actually weighing on the player's mind what they're trying to do now. You're making things simple, and that could be in the control scheme and how it feels, or like it could be in how you move pieces around a board. And there's games which might like give you enough information on here that like when you move something to the board, you're kind of told what you're supposed to be doing with it. So I think the way that you kind of overcome some of those problems, and certainly cutting is definitely a big part of it, is also to ensure that you reduce cognitive load by improving the player's awareness of what they're actually doing in both scenarios. Yeah.
I appreciate the question, because now it's a Jared versus Paul fight. Let's go. I think in video games you've got a lot more scope to hide that. If you want that idea to go, you can hide the complexity underneath it. So in a board game you have to simplify to get around it, right? Like either through UI or through cutting. But in video games, you're like, oh no, I really want this to happen. This has to happen. Okay, we'll actually hide a bunch of this from the player, and it'll just kind of pop up, and they won't necessarily know the mechanic or the thing behind it, but like you'll just see the outcome of it, right?
Yeah, because you've reduced the complexity behind the hood. You've made it like really simple in front of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more difficult to do in a board game for sure, but you can. You still want to look at the ways of reducing that complexity in the board game for the player. When they do something, it might actually be a more complex action than what they feel like they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually probably, how we're saying like board games were, board games and video games, they're pretty much designing the same thing, kind of like that. you're a game designer, right? And I think really most of the differences are in the normal curve of the problem that you're talking about, right? It's like the normal curve for the board game might be out here, and the normal curve for the video game might be out here. So they're just kind of like different levels of difficulty for each of them, rather than it's completely not there or completely there. Kind of most of it is in that the degree of it. Yeah.
Now, are there anyone we've missed that was asking earlier? Oh, so we go that one, and we'll work way back here.
So there have been some examples of games that have like tried to adapt themselves from one medium into another. Like I know there's you have like the Baldur's Gate games adapting tabletop games into video games, and you have things like I think Stardew Valley has made a board game version of itself. I think they tried to make a Skyrim board game at some point. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, if you have any experience with that, some things that they've done right, some things that they've done wrong, and if there are any things that you have worked on that you would like to see tried to adapt from one to the other.
This is a huge question.
I'm going to say my bit. A lot of the video games I've worked on are ones with combat, and I love combat games. I play a lot of combat role-playing games, but the board games haven't been combat focused. In video games, there is the unique thing of, in a real-time combat game, there's a lot of stuff that happens between about 100 milliseconds and 8 seconds of play that's, in a board game, very rarely a problem because they're not usually real-time. And all the adaptations I've seen where there've been games where 400 milliseconds or whatever matters, they've either been completely different games or they've been done very badly. Once you get above 8 seconds, which in combat terms in a real-time game is forever and outside of time and space, is sort of in board game space, I think it's a bit different. But there have been things like Darkest Dungeon had a physical version, which I think they ported too many mechanics across because it was a fully loaded video game and they should have had less in the board game. But then there's things like Slay the Spire, which I believe the implementation is almost the same game because it's such a card game aesthetic kind of game already. But that's my answer. There's a special place between 100 milliseconds and 8 seconds, and that ports very badly between the two.
Yeah, I say it's a huge question because there's lots of these games, lots of video games get taken to board games. And I understand why, because video games are so big and board games want to tap into that kind of market and see if we can get more value from a video game. So something like The Witcher or like any of those games, and you can tack a bunch of miniatures onto them and make them kind of sell in that way. But I haven't played a lot of these games, but a lot of the ones that I played and reviewed and looked at, the biggest problem when porting a game is trying to simulate the game itself. So if I took something like Elden Ring and I wanted it to be about like fighting a boss and like exploring a world and doing friggin' everything that you do in Elden Ring, like that board game is going to be insane. And it's probably not going to be fun.
But it will have a really big miniature.
Yeah, it will. It will have a bunch of really big miniatures, actually. But what you probably want to be looking at when taking a game is like, well, why do people love this game? Like, why do they love the video game? And, you know, maybe it's like that, the tension in the fight. How can I replicate a tension in a fight without just simulating like a lot of the mechanics that are there? Maybe it's not even the fight. Maybe the purpose of trying to take Elden Ring to a board game would be to have that exploration and discovery of like, yeah, you might fight a boss, but fighting the boss is like simple. Like, let's just simplify that. Let's not worry about that so much because it's actually finding the boss and where all these hidden secrets are that could be the thing that you want to do. So I think there's people worry too much about like simulating what the game was without kind of thinking about why the game is successful, and really they don't need to be the same. they should almost be like, well, this is a companion to the world. I do remember when I kind of first started as a designer at A44, and we were making Flintlock, and one of the second thing they wanted me to do was look at making a board game for the game. And I like researched a bunch of games like this, like what's successful, why would you want to make a board game? And my basic discovery was we don't want to make Flintlock as a board game. We want to make a companion to Flintlock as a board game. And I was like, if we take this story that's in the game, we can expand it by making a really interesting board game about it. Maybe it's got some of the same themes. Or, we can there's this war that's happening. Well, we're not exploring that in the game. What if we explored it in the board game? So I think that's really probably the best way to approach that. And I would say it's almost not that it happens that often, but if you take a board game, you want to make it into a video game, it's pretty simple to just take the basic thing. But you're probably better off being like, well, what is it about this board game that I can expand into a more interesting video game that explores the same world that board game was in? So, I would say that for me, I want to see them be different, but capture the same kind of feeling and emotion and theme that you were trying to capture in the original.
Sorry, the only comment I'd have on that one is I think it's actually, it's when you're translating between any media and a different media type, I feel like you have to be a master of this media type to make that transition really well. It feels like it's a lot harder to adapt this into here because you've got the constraints and the expectations, and you have to understand this fully to actually be able to craft that into what you're looking at over here. It's so much easier to start with something brand new over here that you don't have to match that expectation. I mean, designing with constraints is great. Designing with expectations of thousands of fans is troublesome.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that mastery aspect of it is interesting as well. There's a Mass Effect board game coming out. I adore the Mass Effect video games, and they found a game designer, Eric Lang, who's done so many board game designs for lots of different things, and so he's designed this game. So I'm excited about it because I love a lot of the games that he's done, but I haven't played it yet, so I don't know how it feels. But knowing him, it would have been more about trying to get that feeling of these missions and these characters in a story. I think there's a little campaign element to it, rather than trying to be yes, it's precisely this kind of combat, you're shooting your guns. It's probably use a little bit of dice and you gloss over the bits that the systems need to manage in Mass Effect to try and get the feeling of this cool squad-based combat in a board game. So, I mean, that's sort of where you kind of want to make sure that I'm not getting video game designers. I mean, obviously we're saying that game design is the same, but if you've designed your own video game, you're probably better off getting a board game designer who had nothing to do with designing your video game to actually design your board game for you.
We have another question over here, and then we'll go back over there. Oh, it's either one.
Cool, we're going with you. I've recently heard about a number of sort of Kickstarter projects for tabletop games being targeted by copycats, people scraping their images and then producing these shoddy replicas and then listing them on Amazon or other websites and trying to beat them to the punch to ride the coattails of that train. Obviously with a video game you can't you can't really replicate someone else's work and pass it off as your own all that easily.
Totally you can.
Oh.
Maybe.
That's true.
That's probably a different panel, but definitely scraped assets being released in another location happens all the time, and Sam down the back could tell you about the depth shark and all the places it's been, including Korean boy band videos.
I was just going to ask, do you have any advice or strategies for navigating that? Because obviously, if you're making a tabletop game, you need to sort of communicate what the game is, what its mechanics are, the rules and stuff, so people understand it, because it has to live in their heads. So you need to share everything really openly. But how do you prevent that kind of like theft?
So philosophically in board games, I feel you should shove everything physically available in some form so people can see all the bits of the game, which means it's totally stealable. But I also think the people who buy games, particularly board games, actually do care about the provenance. That being said, I've been at tables where people have gone, oh, this is really good, how much is it? Oh, that's quite expensive, I'll go get this little strange Japanese card game off Temu where it'll only be $10, and I kind of grit my teeth and go, okay.
Regicide, you can, like, we literally published the rules and that's all you need, so it was a kind of free-to-play game. You could purchase the art from us, kind of the arted deck, but like even the arted deck, as soon as we sent files off to China, for manufacturing, you're kind of like, this might show up, and so then we had Russian knockoffs and stuff going on. But I think in general, it's like video games. You be loud about it, you be first about it, and then you hope that that's enough to carry you through. Pretty much, that's been my take. There's not much you can really do.
It's certainly very difficult to fight greed and capitalism in this world, and you just kind of have to go with that. It is sad. I mean, there's a fantastic little card game called Scout, and I've played the Temu version of it, apparently, and I've seen the difference. I've played one person had like the proper version. It's minor differences in some of the way that things are printed because it was printed quickly and cheaply. But that is, I guess, the only really recourse that you have. Like if you kickstart your game, it's not published or printed yet. Like the files aren't, there's more than just the rules to the files. So the art director probably needs to put together everything and like specific how all the pieces are going to be. If you are going to have miniatures for the game, then they might not be, they could be 3D sculpted, but not actually then made into something that you can make those molds out of yet. So there's all of those sorts of elements where it's not that easy to take a Kickstarter page and then publish a game, because that's where all the cost is. So yeah, you need to also raise revenue if you don't have any to make the game as well. So I haven't seen it happen as much. Definitely with those little card games, it's so easy to just reprint them, unfortunately.
Only peripherally related. If you take a video game asset, do not assume you can turn it into a big plastic model without a lot of work. But that's related to scraping data and using it.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about a scale question earlier. I mean, like most board game companies or board games are a lot smaller, but there are some big companies like Awaken Realms. They have more people at their studio than we have at our studio, and they have a lot of sculptors that are making character models, because a lot of their development and money comes from the fact that they sell lots of miniatures with their games. So there is definitely models where you will in board games be working with a lot more people then, and in video games there's also small groups where you might have 5 people that you're just working with, or even like lots of games are made by one person.
We had a very patient question back there.
Who are we going to, Carl? Over here?
Yeah.
Hey, curious to know if working on video games has kind of challenged your fundamental look at board games. Like maybe, for example, most board games I've played are turn-based, because that's a very fundamental board game thing. But I wonder if working in games has sort of made you re-look at that, and if that's given you new revelations, or if it's just reinforced what you've already known about it.
So I'm going to quickly answer this. So this is something that does exist in board games, but all the board games I used to love were ones with very little randomness. And then I worked on a computer game which was all randomness all the time, with thousands of things. And then later on got to do a card game version of that computer game for a conference. And the fact that my brain had been broken by computer randomness meant we got to do thousands and thousands of cards. So that was actually a thing where I'd learned a thing from video games which technically does exist in board games, but I had a completely new perspective of it because of working on it in video games. The other thing though is combat is hard. Video game combat is hard. I've luckily always worked with people who are also good combat designers. I can do combat design myself, but I generally work at beyond the 8-second mark, if that makes sense. But I'll leave it to these guys to discuss it as well.
Yeah, one thing that's kind of a little bit new in the board game space is the introduction of real-time board games that are beyond party games, pretty much, beyond Pictionary or that kind of thing. There's a few more and more things are appearing where there's a game called 5 Minute Dungeon, where it's still a little game, but it's like real time. I'm working on a real time game at the moment, so that's kind of like there's this weird kind of like stuff you learn in just in video games that is the real time element that is actually kind of migrating into board games, which is quite interesting.
I'm going to fight you on this. It's not new. It is definitely not new. It's actually, I would say, there's been a life cycle in board games where certain mechanics that came around in 2010 kind of overwhelmed the design ethic of board games, and a lot of new designers came on because they saw how they could make these games. And Kickstarter also made it a lot easier for people to actually make a game and then try and present it to the public instead of having to go through a publisher, where publishers would look at lots of games and they'd be like, well, this is different, this is unique, this is interesting, and we'll develop these and we'll leave these ones aside. So kind of if someone has an idea and gets it far enough along, they're able to present it to the whole world as something that you can have, as opposed to like publishers choosing what gets shown to people. But those mechanics have kind of made, like, for a long time, kind of that's where the board games kind of move towards, and people trying to work on how to change those mechanics and use them in more interesting ways. But they sort of forgot about some of the past that was in board games. So I agree, like 5 Minute Dungeon is like, it's a fun simultaneous game. But Carl and I, way back in before 2000, a little bit before then, I remember us playing like a game where you're like throwing down these ships on this just on the table, and they've got like lasers and shields, and you're trying to like make sure that you like laser everyone else and protect your ships, and everyone's just throwing down their ships like at the same time. It takes 5 minutes, and then it takes like another 5 minutes to figure out who died. So that they've certainly been around in the past. And
The Game is Lightspeed by James Ernest.
Yeah. What was the game? Sorry.
Yeah. And it's just that people kind of, and older games that you would use auctions, which would keep like simultaneous play, but people really stopped using things like auctions in modern games. So I think there's just it's probably an evolution. It's probably similar in video games, where the games, like what becomes popular, people start like latching onto it, and you kind of keep making like similar things because they're successful, and you've got more of that kind of breadth of knowledge of how to make these games because more people are making the same sorts of things. So you kind of keep producing things that are successful and that you can kind of pull from like those resources. But yeah, I think I would love to see more people try more things with board games for sure, because there's a lot of opportunity there to try like weird stuff, and there's so I think video games do like social as well. It's a little bit more difficult, but it's something that they try, but they're not. I guess they don't in the same way like board games. Social board games seem to be more accessible to a lot more people, and then social video games don't seem to be as accessible to the majority because a lot of people want to play single-player video games.
I'm going to sneak one of my questions in. Which is easier, prototyping board games or prototyping video games?
Here we go. Do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, sure. You want me to start on this one?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I find that the difference between the two is that with a board game, and we make different board games here, to get it in front of people, to play test it, you need to have a full prototype made. It doesn't have to be pretty. I like making them a bit pretty because it helps with the understanding, and actually if you can get your UI aspects in place, then you'll see like where people are having pain points. But making that prototype and changing that prototype is quite a lot of work. So that first prototype in a board game, like getting everything together and making it actually a physical copy of it and getting it in front of people to play is difficult. It takes time, and that you kind of like you worked out all the mechanics, and then you're trying to like make it all fit together and get a prototype down, and then people will play it and it's not going to work. I can tell you that 100% of the time. The first time there'll be something you got to probably take one or two things from it that you're like, yes, I love this, but the rest of it, like, let's just stop playing now, sorry. And you have to go back and redo a lot of it. And in a video game, I think like if you were starting from scratch, you had like nothing. It probably takes a lot of time to get to that point as well. But you can iterate on smaller mechanics a lot faster in a video game. And certainly I work in Unreal, and the ability to kind of change something when you see it not working, it's a lot faster, but you also have more people that you can work with on it. Getting a video game to the end and getting a board game to the end, both of them are not easy. But I feel like getting something that you can test earlier to see if it's fun, because you can test individual things to see if they feel fun in a video game, whereas it's a much more difficult in a board game. You kind of need to almost test the entire experience every time. Even if you stop it halfway through, you're like, actually, I've got enough out of this. But you're wanting that full experience for people to play. Whereas in a video game, I find you can test like little parts of the experience, not the whole game. And even when you play test it, you very rarely put the entire game in front of like people until much, much later in the process.
Okay, I'd like to now hear the opposing view.
For the opposing team, I pretty much disagree with that in a fundamental way. I have a couple of examples. So in board gaming, I think getting the first prototype down can be borderline instantaneous, from idea to we're playing it. So I've got what the example there is Regicide. Me and Luke and Andy were sitting at a table. Luke throws me a pack of cards and he says, make me a dungeon crawler out of a 52 deck of cards. And so we sat there for a few minutes. We were like, okay, this. We tested it, we played it, and those rules were probably 80% complete to what we shipped, probably 80, 90. So that was like just straight up. And if you had come to me and said, hey, can you make a dungeon crawler in a video game? Just give me a quick little test. I want to see this little dungeon crawler that's got this little mechanic. That's not going to take me an hour. That's going to take me 2 weeks, even if I have an engine there to get something that I can test as fun. And the other one is the game I was working on. I'm working on now. It's a real-time strategy game. Real-time legacy-ish game. My son comes to me and he goes, "Oh, Dad, I've got this really cool idea. What if we had a timer and you roll the dice and you're taking as much as you can off the board and you're kind of passing it around and then you build equipment with it." I'm like, "Oh, that's actually quite a cool idea." Okay, went away that night, came back the next day. "Hey, James, let's play the game." And so we sat down, we play tested the first run of it. Now that one is a much cut down, smaller version. It was just like the first little bit of it. It wasn't the full game. But like going from idea to first play was like one night. Whereas James comes to me and he goes, "Dad, I've got a really good idea for a video game. I want to do this. And I'm like, that's a great idea, son. You should make that. sometime once you've learned how to code, because I don't have 8 weeks of my life to put into that for you just to show you what it could be. Like, so I think there's definitely, I think kicking off a board game can be quite quick. I do, however, agree with you on the iteration part. There's an iteration phase that sometimes in some parts of video games can be faster to like put in a little change, get it to someone to test, and get the feedback on that. Whereas in board games, unless you're doing like number tweaks, then actually like making more componentry for it does actually take some time.
For your reg slide example, you had all of the components right there. Yeah, you already had the entire board card, components that already existed for you.
That's your Unreal Engine, right?
Yeah.
I already had my Unreal Engine.
You already had your Unreal Engine, but I do think that's like, I think even with like Deep Sea, we did it in spreadsheets and we had a bunch of ideas for mechanics and actions, and we could kind of play a little bit of the turn pretty early on. Just like moving like numbers around in a spreadsheet. But to me, it is kind of the difference between, I guess it's the core difference is that in a video game, you probably often want to test something smaller, like a mechanic or a combat situation, or just even you're not even testing a full gameplay loop, you might just be testing one part of it. Whereas in a board game, you can do some of that stuff early, but the minute you want to get it in front of players, you have to have everything.
I'm going to briefly mention a lot of testing for board games these days, particularly published ones, is done in electronic form, and all the tools for it are garbage.
So any developers who want to develop good testing tools for...
And it's mostly because it's not data-driven, and if you're used to your computer game's been data-driven, like if you do something on Tabletop Simulator, you have to import a bunch of images, and then you want to change a number, which means you have to change them somewhere else and then import a bunch of images. And
there's a good tool for that called Dexterous, which you can pipe into that.
Right.
A small improvement.
A small improvement.
A small improvement that lets you pipe images in data-driven ways.
But I also have similar experience. Like I used to work at Grinding Gear Games on Halo Excel, and if you want to change something on the screen and prototype something with some UI, you grab your UI programmer and your UI artist and sit them down and work out exactly what you want, and then they go away and do it over a period of time. And then my first experience with Unreal of sticking some data on the screen was like, oh, you just do it. Wow, that's amazing. I can just throw a number on the screen and I don't need anyone's help to do it.
And then you can show your artist and your UI programmer and they can make it much nicer for you, but at least you've been able to show them what your idea is straight away.
Yeah, although I will say Unreal is, in most engines, are really good at prototyping super fast the stuff the engine's really good at. And as soon as you go a little bit beyond that, you're sort of working through molasses again. But yeah, prototyping in Unreal is pretty nice. I work from an Unreal shop, so that's probably advertising. The Unity guys who were here on the stage before us, they'd probably say similar things.
I think I would say that playtesting, rather than prototyping, but playtesting is a lot easier in video games. There's a lot more systems set up for it. I haven't heard of I know that like if you're at a video game studio, sometimes you have like a UAT kind of setup, right? I haven't really heard of a board game like UAT setups with people who are like running that.
Matt Leacock used to be an experienced designer at Yahoo, who then went on to make Pandemic and Pandemic Season 1, and he ported all those skills across. So yeah, that's a really good example of someone having that sort of full-on user experience training and just bringing it across and immediately becoming one of the most, celebrated designers.
Imagine having a QA team that just like tested your board game like over and over and over and over again, like every day, and they brought new people in to do it and they gave you feedback on it like instantly at the end of every day. How amazing would that be?
It's something that could be achieved. It's just like it's still a bit of a pipe dream for a lot of board game designers. But but just the physicality of getting a board game out to people to play it, they have to get 4 people to sit around, play the game, rather than be able to just digitally go, you've got an update, please play it again, right? Which is why lots of board games are tested online.
I have another question I'd love to throw them, but if anyone else has a question, this is your one chance to sneak it in.
Yeah, so it is lunchtime if anyone wants to leave for lunch, but if you're really interested, you can stay here. There's no one in the room until end of lunchtime, so...
We'll at least get this question in.
Yeah, so we can just keep going with questions. Here you go.
I'd love to hear your thoughts as designers on board games coming to digital form as the board game itself. So Wormspan, Wingspan, and especially maybe speaking to something like Codenames that came to digital form recently, which wasn't a direct port, but is very much like Codenames, but has this kind of like social element as well, which is an incredible achievement for something like Codenames. So what are your thoughts on like board games directly translating into video game form?
Do you want to go? No.
I think the pandemic probably helped that, because I remember I probably played more board games during COVID when we were locked away than I do now, because every night we would just get on BGA and play like all of the various games that were there, and I'd be able to hang out with my friends and play till too late, multiple games a night, and it was just the one way that you could communicate. And I think that's probably carried on in anything where video games are probably more accessible, weirdly, to people than board games are. So having those kind of ports, or even just re-implementations, and maybe they're done in a different way, it will make it easier for people to get into this sort of hobby. And then maybe, I would say, what you're looking for in the board game hobby is often that social aspect. So when you have something like a friend of mine plays Terra Mystica on BGA still to this day, but they don't talk to the other people playing. They'll often talk to each other, and they might play two-handed, and that because that's their community and friendship, and it's still there. But for me, I don't really like playing on an online platform if I'm not going to be talking with people, because that's kind of the thing that I get out of board games. Whereas I'll play video games by myself rather than play them with other people, and both of them kind of work. There's lots of solo gamers for board gaming as well. But yeah, having that way to bridge the divide between, I have to go buy this physical copy, I have to get people into my house to play the game, or I can go online and it's here and I can play it with people who maybe I'll meet new people that way. I think that's, it's good. Yeah.
I'll approach it slightly differently in terms of me as a designer. As a designer, I kind of am bored of a digital implementation of a board game. It's not interesting to me in really to do that. In that board games, like you said, sitting around a table playing the board game, there's just some magic that happens just from that, right? In the board game, it does that. Things that are much more interesting to me as a designer is things like Slay the Spire, where it's taken board game elements and used the unique, kind of combined the unique elements of video games and board games together. Not that I'm saying that having those digital implementations is bad, or people shouldn't enjoy them, or all that thing, but it's just for me, I would rather design board games to have a connection around a table, and video games to excel in what they really excel at, which is hiding a lot of that complexity and doing a bunch of background stuff to present experiences in the way that they can uniquely do it, I guess. So it's just from a design, from my perspective.
It is interesting to me that some games translate very, very poorly onto a digital play, and games which you think only have a few decisions. My example would be there's an auction game called Ra, and if you've ever played an electronic version of that, it's one of the few board games that takes longer to play digitally than it does face-to-face, because there are actually hundreds and hundreds of decisions, which are people going, no, I'm not bidding for this, which round a table you automatically do and backtrack when you need to, and you just can't do on a computer. And also, if you ever think about a game you're working on and how it would be electronically implemented, you'll soon find your rules are way squishier than you thought. But you should learn to deal with all your edge cases and smooth them out anyway.
That's the trying to put Magic the Gathering onto computer versus Hearthstone for me. In terms of like, if you try and put Magic the Gathering onto into the computer and like play it as you would at a table, you pass priority, pass priority, pass priority, pass priority, right?
Yeah.
And like, no one wants to do that, right? They want Hearthstone. Well, no one. Hearthstone is where like it's been specifically designed so that we don't have priority windows. You play, they play. You play, they play. And so just like being able to smooth off those edges that you would get from physical games.
And then it's very difficult to take something like Hearthstone and make a physical version of it because it was designed to be a computer implementation of that kind of versus with creatures sorcery card game. So it's like, well, we want Magic, but we don't. Like, we want to create
also,
like the video.
Hearthstone has so many secret rules that are not expressed with the timing that it's bizarre, actually, if you try and work out what the rules to Hearthstone are. They are not straightforward at all. We should probably stop as we've gone over time. Did anyone have a burning question they wanted answered? You can come hassle these gentlemen or myself.
Yeah, I will talk about board games.
If you can get these two together, you can wind them up and make them fight.
Yeah.
Ask them about board game studios and whether people work at them. But thank you for coming.